The air in the town hall was thin and cold, smelling of damp wool and old paper. Anneliese stood near the back, one hand resting on the broad, steady head of her German shepherd, Fenn. Her other hand clutched the strap of a worn canvas satchel, the only thing of value she owned besides the dog. At 18, she had the quiet posture of someone used to being overlooked, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, tracing the lines where countless boots had worn the wood smooth. The room buzzed with the low murmur of ranchers and merchants, their faces a mixture of feigned sympathy and raw curiosity. They were all here for the final act of old Mr. Abernathy's life, the reading of his will. He had taken her from the county orphanage a decade ago, providing a small, drafty room and simple meals in exchange for chores. He had been a man of few words, his kindness expressed in small gestures, an extra blanket on a cold night, a shared piece of dried apple. Now he was gone, and his world was being carved up by men in starched collars. At the front of the room, Marcus Thorne, Abernathy's business partner, cleared his throat. He was a man built of confidence and expensive tailoring, his smile a polished instrument of public charm. He held the will aloft. As executor of my dear friend's estate, he began, his voice resonating with practiced solemnity, I am honored to carry out his final wishes. He spoke of Abernathy's generosity, his vision for the territory. Then he began the distribution. Large parcels of land went to the town council. A significant sum of gold was pledged for a new church bell. Thorne himself, as the surviving partner in all ventures, inherited the sprawling ranch, the livestock, and the controlling interest in the bank. A wave of approving nods moved through the crowd. Thorne was securing his position as the town's undisputed patriarch. Finally, he looked toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Anneliese. A smirk played at the edge of his lips. And for the girl, Anneliese, he announced, his voice laced with a theatrical pity that was sharper than any insult. For her years of service, Mr. Abernathy leaves her $1 silver. A few stifled snickers broke the silence, then blossomed into outright laughter. The sound washed over Anneliese, cold and sharp. Thorne held up a single, tarnished coin. To help her on her way, he added, dropping it onto the polished table with a dismissive clink. He beckoned her forward. Every eye was on her as she walked the length of the room, Fenn padding silently at her heel. She did not look at the laughing faces. She looked only at the coin. She picked it up, its metal cool against her skin, and closed her fingers around it. She met Thorne's gaze for a single, fleeting moment. Her expression was unreadable, a placid lake under a grey sky. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear in the sudden quiet. She turned and walked out, her back straight, the dog a loyal shadow beside her. The laughter resumed behind her, louder this time, the sound of a predator enjoying its victory. The next morning, a hard frost had silvered the panes of Anneliese's small window. The shack she called home offered little defense against the biting winter cold. She sat on her cot, the silver dollar resting in her palm, its surface worn smooth with age. Fenn lay with his head on her lap, his warm breath fogging in the frigid air. There was a sharp knock on the door. Anneliese flinched. Eviction, she thought. Thorne wouldn't waste any time. She opened the door to find a man she recognized from the will reading. He was tall and thin, dressed in a severe black coat, his face all sharp angles and quiet observation. He had stood beside Thorne but had not laughed. I am Alistair Finch, he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. Mr. Abernathy's solicitor. He did not ask to come in but simply looked at her, his gaze taking in the bare room, the threadbare blanket, the dog. Pack what you own. We are leaving. Anneliese's heart hammered against her ribs. She had nowhere to go. Leaving where? She asked, her voice small. Finch's expression did not soften. To a place of Mr. Abernathy's choosing. He was a man of specific instructions. He looked down at Fenn, who watched him with intelligent, unblinking eyes. The dog comes. There was no room for argument in his tone. It was a statement of fact. Anneliese had little to pack. A change of clothes, a worn book of poems Abernathy had given her, and the silver dollar, which she slipped deep into her pocket. She followed Finch outside to where two sturdy horses stood, their breath pluming in the icy air. The journey was long and silent. Finch rode ahead, a stark figure against the endless white of the snow-covered plains. They left the town far behind, heading toward the jagged peaks of the mountains that loomed on the horizon, their stone faces grim and forbidding. The landscape grew wilder, the trail narrowing as they entered the deep pine forests that clung to the lower slopes. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of hooves in the snow and the occasional call of a hawk circling high above. Annalise had never been this far from town. The world she knew had shrunk to the rhythm of her horse's gait and the reassuring presence of Fen, who trotted tirelessly beside them. Hours turned into a day, and as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the snow, Finch finally reined in his horse. They stood before a sheer cliff face, a massive wall of granite that seemed to block all further passage. There was no path, no gate, no sign of human habitation. "We are here," Finch stated, dismounting. Annalise looked around, confused. "Here? In the middle of nowhere?" Finch walked toward the rock wall, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He stopped and turned back to her. "The inheritance," he said, his voice flat. Mr. Abernathy was quite clear. "You must present it." Annalise dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She approached Finch, her boots making soft thuds in the deep snow. Fen stayed close, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he eyed the silent wall of rock. The cold was intense here, in the shadow of the mountain. It seeped through her worn coat, chilling her to the bone. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Finch simply held out his gloved hand. "The dollar," Miss Annalise slowly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the single silver coin. It felt heavy, substantial, more than just $1. It felt like a question she didn't know how to ask. She placed it in his palm. He didn't look at it. Instead, he turned back to the cliff face, running his hand over the frozen stone. His fingers traced patterns that were invisible to her, lines and grooves that seemed entirely natural. He stopped at a spot where a patch of dark moss clung to the rock. With deliberate precision, he pressed the edge of the silver dollar into a tiny, almost imperceptible slit hidden within the moss. There was a low grinding sound, the groan of stone on stone. A section of the cliff face, a piece of rock so vast and solid she had thought it part of the mountain itself, began to recede inward. A dark opening appeared, revealing a long, stone-lined tunnel lit by oil lamps set into niches in the wall. The air that drifted out was cool but dry, carrying the faint scent of leather and old books. Mr. Abernathy valued privacy above all else, Finch said, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden opening. He gestured for her to enter. "Welcome to his home." Annalise hesitated for a moment, looking from the dark tunnel to the vast, empty wilderness behind her. Fen nudged her hand with his nose, giving a soft whine of encouragement. She took a breath and stepped across the threshold, into the mountain. The stone door ground shut behind them, sealing them inside. The mansion was not a mansion in the way she understood it. It was a fortress carved from the heart of the mountain, a sprawling labyrinth of stone corridors, vast libraries, and quiet studies. The main room was immense, with a ceiling that soared 2 stories high, supported by columns of natural, unworked stone. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with thousands of volumes. In the center of the room sat a massive table, its surface covered not with fine china, but with maps, geological surveys, and stacks of ledgers bound in dark leather. The wool reading in town was a necessity, Finch explained, removing his coat. It was a performance for one man's benefit, Marcus Thorne. Mr. Abernathy knew his partner's greed. He knew Thorne would see you as an insignificant loose end, a girl to be dismissed with a single coin. He picked up one of the ledgers. "This is your true inheritance, Annalise. Not wealth, but knowledge. Not land, but leverage." Annalise walked slowly around the great table, her fingertips brushing against the worn leather of the ledgers. The scale of it all was overwhelming. This hidden world of numbers and lines, of assets and debts, was a language she did not speak. Fen explored the room cautiously, his claws clicking softly on the flagstone floor before he settled near the large, unlit fireplace, as if assuming the role of guardian in this strange new place. "Mr. Abernathy built 2 empires," Finch continued, his voice losing some of its clipped formality, replaced by a deep, resonant respect. The one Thorn knew was built on land and cattle. It was profitable, but it was a shell. The real enterprise was this. He gestured to the room, to the endless records. Information. He tracked every transaction, every loan, every foreclosure Thorn ever engineered. He saw the pattern long ago. Thorn doesn't build, he consumes. He finds good people, extends them credit they cannot afford, and then seizes their land when they default. Finch opened a ledger to a marked page. The handwriting was meticulous, Abernathy's precise script detailing the ruin of a family Annalise knew, the Millers, who had lost their small farm last spring. Thorn called this sound business as Mr. Abernathy called it theft. He looked at Annalise, his gaze steady and intense. He did not leave you $1. He left you a defense. He left you the truth. For the next several weeks, the mountain became Annalise's entire world. Her days were spent in the great library, under Finch's demanding tutelage. He was a relentless teacher. He started with basic arithmetic, then moved to accounting, contract law, and resource management. He taught her how to read a balance sheet like a story, to see the narrative of a family's struggle in a column of figures. He showed her how Thorn manipulated water rights, created artificial shortages of seed, and used his bank to strangle his own clients. There was no kindness in his method, only an unyielding expectation that she would understand. Sentiment is a liability, he would say, pointing to a name in a ledger. This is not about anger. It is about imbalance. Your task is to restore it. Annalise was a surprisingly adept student. Her quiet, observant nature, born from years of watching from the sidelines, had honed her ability to see patterns others missed. She saw the web Thorn had spun across the entire territory, a network of debt and obligation that funneled all wealth toward him. The work was grueling. Often, she would study until her eyes burned, the numbers blurring on the page. In those moments, Fen would rest his heavy head on her knee, a silent, comforting presence. Her motivation began to change. At first, it was about survival, about understanding the strange legacy she had been given. But as she read the stories of the families Thorn had destroyed, a quiet, cold anger began to smolder within her. This was not just about her. It was about the Millers, the Davidsons, the Ortegas, all the names in Abernathy's books. She was not just Abernathy's heir, she was his instrument. One afternoon, as a blizzard raged outside, blanketing the mountain in a thick shroud of white, the silence of the mansion was broken by a faint, distant sound. Fen's head shot up, his ears twitching, and a low growl vibrated in his chest. Finch, who had been reviewing a map of water rights, went still. He moved to a small, unassuming panel on the wall and slid it open, revealing a complex series of polished brass tubes and earpieces. It was a listening device, connected to sensors Abernathy had placed along the hidden approach to the mansion. Finch put an earpiece to his ear, his face impassive. He listened for a full minute before speaking. "A single rider," he said, his voice calm. "He found the trail." Thorn has grown impatient. Annalise felt a surge of fear, cold and sharp. "He found us." Finch shook his head. "He found the path. The entrance remains sealed. But his curiosity is a weapon he will now use against us." He looked at Annalise. "Thorn will not come himself. He will send someone to probe, someone who appears harmless." A few days later, the rider appeared again. This time, he came on foot, leading his horse, making a show of being lost in the storm. Through a cleverly concealed periscope that gave a view of the cliffside, Annalise and Finch watched him. He was a young deputy from town, a man named Peters, known for his easy smile and friendly demeanor. He made a small, smoky fire, huddled against the cold, and waited. He was the bait. "Thorn believes you are a simple girl, frightened and alone," Finch said, his eyes never leaving the periscope. "He expects you to seek help from a familiar face. He is counting on your fear." He turned to Annalise. "We will not disappoint him." The plan was simple, and its success depended entirely on Annalise. The next morning, she would escape the mountain. She would allow Peters to find her, appearing lost, terrified, and desperate. Finch coached her for hours, refining every detail of her story. She was to speak of a secret cabin, of a strange old man who had taken her there, of her fear and confusion. She was not to mention Finch or the true nature of the mansion. Let his assumptions do the work, Finch instructed her. Thorne's arrogance is his greatest vulnerability. He cannot conceive of a world that does not revolve around his own cleverness. The next day, Annalise slipped out through a secondary, smaller exit a quarter-mile down the mountain face. She stumbled through the deep snow, her clothes artfully torn, her face pale with a mixture of real and feigned terror. Peters found her within the hour. His face registered the perfect blend of surprise and concern. "Miss Annalise? What in heavens are you doing out here?" He wrapped her in a blanket, his voice full of warmth and reassurance. She played her part perfectly, her story a jumble of half-truths and frightened whispers. He listened patiently, his eyes filled with sympathy, but Annalise could see a flicker of something else behind them, the glint of victory. He was reporting every word back to his master in his mind. He had found the lost girl. The hook was set. Deputy Peters led Annalise back toward town, treating her with a gentle, paternal care that felt more suffocating than the cold. He spoke of Thorne's deep concern for her welfare, how he had organized search parties, how the whole town was worried. It was a masterful performance. Annalise, in turn, maintained her facade of a frightened, bewildered orphan, overwhelmed by her ordeal. She allowed him to believe he was her savior. As they rode, she saw the landscape not as a wilderness, but as a chessboard. She saw the streams and noted the places where Thorne had illegally dammed them, just as Abernathy's maps had shown. She saw the small, struggling homesteads and knew, with chilling certainty, which ones were next on Thorne's list. The knowledge Finch had given her was like a second sight, revealing the hidden machinery of power that lay beneath the surface of the world. Peters delivered her directly to Marcus Thorne's office at the bank. Thorne rose from his large oak desk, his face a mask of profound relief. "Annalise, my dear child," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "We were so worried. Where have you been?" He dismissed the deputy with a grateful nod. Alone with her, his demeanor shifted. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a sharp, calculating curiosity. "Tell me everything." Annalise recounted the story Finch had prepared for her, describing a dilapidated miner's cabin and a crazed old prospector who had mistaken her for his long-lost daughter. She kept her eyes downcast, her voice trembling. Thorne listened, his fingers steepled, his gaze analytical. He believed her. Or rather, he believed his own interpretation of the story, that Abernathy had hidden a small stash of gold in the mountains and this girl had stumbled upon it. Her disappearance wasn't a threat, it was an opportunity. "You are safe now," he said, patting her hand condescendingly. "I will take care of you." His version of care was to place her in a room at the local boarding house, with 2 of his men posted outside her door. She was not a guest, she was a prisoner. But this, too, was part of Finch's plan. They had successfully moved a piece from their side of the board to his, and he was completely unaware that she was not a pawn, but a queen in waiting. For the next week, she remained in the boarding house, her isolation giving Thorne a sense of total control. He was preparing for his masterstroke, a town meeting where he would finalize the foreclosure on 3 of the largest remaining independent homesteads in the valley. It was to be the public coronation of his absolute power. He saw it as a formality. He had no idea it was going to be a trial. On the morning of the meeting, Finch's signal came. A single, high-flying hawk, a bird he had trained to respond to a whistle, circled over the town. It was time. The town hall was more crowded than it had been for the will reading. The air was thick with tension and despair. The owners of the 3 homesteads stood at the front, their faces grim, their families clustered behind them. They had come not to fight, but to witness the formal death of their livelihoods. Marcus Thorne stood on the raised platform, radiating an aura of regretful authority. He spoke of economic hardship, of difficult but necessary decisions, of the bank's responsibility to its investors. His words were smooth, reasonable, and utterly devoid of mercy. "It is with a heavy heart," he concluded, that the bank must take possession of these properties. Just as he was about to bring down the gavel of his authority, the main doors of the hall swung open. Annalise stood there. She was not the timid, shivering girl he had locked away. She was composed, her posture straight, her gaze level. She wore a simple, dark dress, and at her side, silent and imposing, was Fen. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thorn's face tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Annalise, this is not the place for you," he said, his voice sharp with paternalistic dismissal. "This is business for men." Annalise walked slowly down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She did not look at Thorn. She looked at the homesteaders. "This is business for everyone whose name is in your ledgers," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. She stopped at the foot of the platform, holding a single, slim leather-bound book. It was one of Abernathy's. "You speak of hardship," she said, her eyes finally lifting to meet Thorn's. "Let us speak of the hardship you created." Thorn laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "And what would a girl like you know of such things?" "I know how to read," she replied calmly. And she began. She opened the book and, in a clear, unwavering voice, she detailed the systematic destruction of the first family, the Jacksons. She cited dates and figures. She explained how Thorn's bank had extended a loan for seed, knowing full well the supply chain had been intentionally disrupted by one of his own subsidiary companies. She described how the interest rate was secretly compounded daily, not monthly as stated in the agreement. She read from a letter, penned by Thorn himself to an associate, outlining the strategy. The room was utterly silent. The Jacksons stared, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. Thorn's smile had vanished. "These are lies," he blustered. "Fabrications from a troubled young mind." "Then perhaps you can explain the discrepancies in your own official ledgers," Annalise countered, producing a second book. "This one details the true value of the land you are seizing for pennies on the dollar, based on mineral surveys you commissioned and then buried." She had him. The specificity of her accusations, the cold, hard data, was undeniable. She was not making an emotional appeal, she was presenting a case, piece by irrefutable piece. The mood in the room shifted from resignation to a low, simmering rage. The people were not just hearing about a crime, they were seeing the architecture of their own oppression laid bare. The public exposure was only the beginning. The town meeting had shattered Thorn's carefully constructed image of a benevolent leader. The homesteaders, now armed with Annalise's evidence, refused to vacate their properties. The town council, fearing the growing anger of its constituents, called for a formal inquiry. The venue was not a public hall, but the place where Thorn's power was most concentrated, the boardroom of his own bank. The room was paneled in dark, polished wood, designed to intimidate. A long, heavy table dominated the space. Thorn sat at its head, flanked by two expensive lawyers from the city. He had regained some of his composure, believing he could crush this rebellion with legal maneuvering and contractual jargon. Annalise sat at the opposite end of the table. Her only counsel was Alistair Finch, who sat beside her, a silent, watchful presence. She looked small and out of place in the grand, imposing room. Thorn's lead lawyer began, his voice condescending. He dismissed Annalise's claims as the misinterpretations of an unschooled girl, manipulated by unknown parties. He presented thick stacks of documents, signed contracts, and loan agreements. "The law is clear," he concluded with a smug smile. "These are legal, binding agreements." When he finished, there was a heavy silence. Annalise did not seem intimidated. She looked at Finch, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. She then placed a single, slender document on the table. "The law is indeed clear," she said, her voice quiet but resonant in the wood-paneled room. "As is the final codicil of Mr. Abernathy's true last will and testament." Thorn stiffened. The will was read. "It is a matter of public record." "The will was read," Finch corrected him, speaking for the first time. His voice was like the scraping of stone. But it was not his final will. It was an instrument, designed to be activated by a specific set of circumstances. Annalise slid the document across the polished table. This codicil, she explained, was to be enacted only in the event that you, Mr. Thorne, attempted to use your position as executor to seize assets through foreclosure from any individual or family named in Mr. Abernathy's private ledgers. An act which you performed, quite publicly, 3 days ago. Thorne's lawyer snatched the paper. As he read, the color drained from his face. His colleague leaned over, and his jaw went slack. Thorne, seeing their reactions, ripped the document from their hands. His eyes scanned the page, his confident facade crumbling line by line. The codicil was an elegant piece of legal devastation. It stated that any such predatory action would be considered a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of the partnership agreement he had with Abernathy. The penalty for this breach was immediate and absolute, the dissolution of the partnership, with all jointly held assets, the bank, the ranch, the land, transferring not to Thorne, but into a trust. A trust to be administered for the benefit of the community and its citizens. The sole, unimpeachable trustee of this new entity? Annalise. The silence that followed was absolute. The grand boardroom, once the heart of Marcus Thorne's empire, became his tomb. The polished wood reflected a face pale with shock and disbelief. The documents his lawyers had so proudly presented were now just stacks of worthless paper. He had been so focused on his own intricate traps that he had never seen the one Abernathy had laid for him years ago, a silent mechanism waiting for his greed to trip the wire. "This is impossible," Thorne whispered, the words catching in his throat. "It's a forgery, it is ironclad," Finch stated flatly. "Witnessed, notarized, and filed with the territorial circuit judge a decade ago. It has been waiting for you all this time." Annalise watched him, not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber finality. She felt no joy in his destruction, only a grim sense of a balance being restored. Thorne looked at her, his eyes wild with a hatred that was almost primal. He saw her now, not as an insignificant orphan, but as the architect of his ruin. He lunged to his feet, his chair crashing backward. You little nobody." His lawyers put restraining hands on his arms, but he shook them off. For a moment, it seemed he might cross the table, that his rage would erupt into violence. But then, something broke within him. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by a hollow, empty grey. He slumped back, a man whose entire identity had been erased in the space of 5 minutes. He was nothing without his power. Finch stood. "I believe our business here is concluded." He and Annalise rose and walked toward the door. They didn't look back. They left Thorne sitting alone at the head of the table in his silent, empty kingdom, a king of dust and echoes. As they stepped out of the bank and into the cold, clean air of the street, the sun was beginning to set, painting the snow on the distant peaks in hues of gold and rose. Annalise took a deep breath. The weight that had been on her shoulders for weeks, the weight of Abernathy's legacy and the town's future, began to lift. It was not gone, but it had transformed. It was no longer a burden to be carried, but a responsibility to be met. She saw the faces of the townspeople watching from across the street, their expressions hesitant, hopeful. They did not rush to congratulate her. They simply watched, waiting to see what she would do next. The power was hers now, but the test had just begun. Her gaze drifted toward the mountains, toward the hidden mansion that had been both her school and her sanctuary. The knowledge it held was no longer just a weapon for a single battle, it was a tool for building a future. Months passed. The harsh winter gave way to a gentle spring. The snows melted, and the valley bloomed with new life. The Thorne Bank was renamed the Abernathy Community Trust. Annalise, with Finch's steady guidance, did not operate from the grand office in town. She worked from the great library in the heart of the mountain, which felt more like home. Her first act as trustee was not one of acquisition, but of release. She went through Abernathy's ledgers, and one by one, she cancelled the predatory debts that Thorne had used as his weapons. She restructured loans with fair terms. She used the trust's funds to invest in new irrigation systems, a schoolhouse, and a proper doctor for the town. She did not rule, she served. She never raised her voice, never gave grand speeches. Her authority came from the quiet competence of her actions. The power that had corrupted Thorne was being used to heal the wounds he had inflicted. The town began to change. The fear that had been a constant undercurrent was replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Families returned to the homesteads they had almost lost, their gratitude toward the quiet young woman in the mountains boundless. They rarely saw her, but they saw the results of her work everywhere, in the full granaries, the repaired fences, the laughter of children who were no longer hungry. On a warm afternoon late in spring, Annalise stood on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. Below her, the territory was a patchwork of green fields and tidy homesteads. Fenn sat beside her, his body pressed against her leg, his gaze fixed on the same horizon. He was, as always, her steadfast companion, her silent witness. Finch walked up the path and stood a respectful distance away. He looked out at the valley, a rare, faint smile touching his lips. He would be proud, he said, the highest praise he was capable of giving. Annalise did not reply immediately. She watched a family in the distance, their figures small but clear, working together in their field. Her victory had not been in the boardroom that day. It was here, in the quiet, ordinary life she had protected. It was in the peace that had settled over the land. Her inheritance had not been the dollar, or the mansion, or even the trust. It was the chance to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than she had found it. She had answered the question of her own life not with wealth or power, but with purpose. What does a person truly owe to the community that shapes them?